What follows is a brief examination of some of the activities of a small clustering of young visual artists who were active from the start of the decade until 1984 and came to be known as the Blk Art Group. In rereading the activities and positions of this group, the fact that it was exclusively comprised of children of Caribbean migrants, raised and located in the fading industrial landscapes of the Midlands and the North during the 1970s, could be seen as playing a formative role in the particular positions, both political and aesthetic, which the group became most associated with. Brought together initially as a group of friends and peers of the young Wolverhampton-based artist Eddie Chambers, pictured here in 1980 by the photographer John Reardon in front of his seminal work, The Destruction of the National Front, and supported by local community activist Eric Pembleton, the group was first assembled as Wolverhampton Young Black Artists to stage an exhibition at the city's art gallery in June 1981. The title of the exhibition, Black Art and Done, emerged from a prolonged conversation during which potential titles, including the Pan-African Connection, were discussed and rejected, to the point that, in exasperation, somebody suggested that the show just be called Black Art. The response to this suggestion was the colloquial exclamation, "You mean just call it Black Art and Done?" Roughly translated, Black Art, full stop. The title stuck. Little did this group of 20-year-olds realise that the term Black Art, far from being done as a definitive and closed marker, would become one of the most contentious and slippery of terms, marking and to some degree distorting creative discourses over the coming decade, arguably to the point of exhaustion, around what black art might be, who could make it, and where its parameters might lie. The all-male lineup of this show could be seen as establishing an early impression of the group as being synonymous with the predominantly masculinized form of address. However, it should be noted that as members of the original lineup, Andrew Hazel, Ian Palmer, and finally Dominic Dawes fell away, they were replaced almost exclusively by female artists. By the time of the group's second show at the Africa Centre, Covent Garden, in June 1982, Claudette Johnson and Wenda Leslie had joined the group. Janet Vernon appears in the lineup for the show a month later at the Icon Gallery, Birmingham, and Marlene Smith was to join, along with Donald Rodney, soon after that. The exhibitions of the summer of 1982 are also marked by the adoption of the title The Pan-African Connection, a use of terminology first defined by group mentor Eric Pembleton in his introduction to the Africa Centre exhibition handout. In it, he clearly identifies the young artist as located within a diasporic reimagining of Africanness, particular to a Caribbean political narrative marked by the dispersions of the Middle Passage, and links this directly with an African-American sensibility through evoking the memory of Martin Luther King. This figuring of Pan-Africanism runs parallel to Eddie Chambers' aspirations around what he proclaimed as art for Uhuru, a re-evoking of the Swahili term for freedom, which had gained traction in the 1970s through figures such as African-American cultural nationalist Ron Karenga. In his text for the Africa Centre, Chambers lays out his aspirations for a socially engaged mode of practice, functioning beyond the wreckage left by centuries of racial terror, to, in his words, strengthen the blacks that remain. Also running parallel to this, in the same exhibition guide, Claudette Johnson begins to expound an equally radical discourse which chooses to evoke the gendered body as a key site of struggle and re-employs lines from Gail Murray's poem of 1970, "I have my own business in this skin and on this planet." The conversation between these two radical forms of address provided a bubbling subtext during the preparation for the group's next major project, already signposted by Chambers in the Africa Centre leaflet. These were plans to stage a black art convention in October of that year in the Faculty of Arts and Design of the Polytechnic, Wolverhampton. The first National Black Art Convention was created as a targeted call to black artists and art students to gather on the 28th of October 1982 in order to discuss the form, functioning and future of something called black art. The event was chaired by Eric Pembleton and group member Janet Vernon, and featured presentations from figures such as Rashid Areen, artist and founder of Black Phoenix and later Third Text, Shaka Dedi, who would go on to found the Black Art Gallery in Finsbury Park, London in 1983, group member Claudette Johnson, and others. Also present were artists such as Frank Bolin, Lubena Himid, Sonia Boyce, members of the Black Audio Film Collective, Anna Mayapple, and others amongst the vocal and engaged audience. The audio record and other archival fragments of this complex, multi-voiced event are now beginning to enter the public domain, and detailed analysis of the day will form the subject of other investigations. However, in the years which followed the event, it came to figure as a watershed moment in which some of the key players and debates which marked the decade, especially around issues such as gender, first overlapped, entered into coalition, and in some instances clashed. However, what interests me here is an examination of the archival record of the impressions of the event which members of the Blk Art Group came away with, and how that shaped events which followed. In a handwritten note, Eddie Chambers refers to what he sees as the shortcomings and failures of previous seminars and discussion groups, and makes it clear that he is referring to our own first National Black Art Convention. This frustration, I would argue, centred around the unresolvable arguments generated by the assertion that artists could or should be corralled into a single category which at times seemed to be defined by nothing more than skin colour, and paid little attention to the vast diversity of creative, conceptual and aesthetic fascinations which fuel the work of artists of colour, from the most esoteric to the most politically strident. Therefore, the impossibility of consensus across such an arbitrarily defined grouping, for which in many cases the declaration that black art must represented an archaic and absurd imposition, began to suggest that a new category of practice was needed, one which could be defined more around the intentionality of the artist, and a shared consensus around the political and societal role of their practice. To this end, a second convention, this time using the prefix radical, to signal a new holistic category of radical black art, was planned for March 1984 at the Ukaidi Centre, Nottingham. In the pre-publicity to this event, an attempt was made to set the parameters of the conversation in advance by signalling that the idea behind this convention is to provide a forum within which those already committed to the view that black art must aim to raise the consciousness of black people can meet together in order to analyse the problems concerned with and work in solutions necessary to ensure the fulfilment of this aim. Furthermore, the programme declared that this convention would provide an opportunity for those actively involved in the production of radical black art to meet together to discuss the form, function and future of their work. And in the preamble, words lifted from Chambers' text bemoaning the shortcomings of the first National Black Art Convention were reproduced almost verbatim. However, in the event, this conference was characterised by frustration and a distinct lack of anything approaching useful consensus. In retrospect, I would argue that this can be traced in part to the surfacing of a bubbling schism which has come to emerge and re-emerge during key developmental moments of black radical thought in the West. The uneasy cohabitation of ideas informed by what could be described as a progressive libertarian socialism, and ideas informed by a radical Afrocentric cultural nationalism, which, although at some levels can coexist as tolerant bedfellows, will begin to shred and splinter when more complex and focused directions are contemplated. This was true within the violent schism which developed between Ron Karenga's US organisation and the Black Panther Party in 1969 in Los Angeles, and in a wholly more genteel and parochial way, it became true of the irritable disagreements around creative practice which took place in a provincial community centre in Nottingham in 1984. In the space between the first National Black Art Convention in October 1982 and the Radical Black Art Convention in Nottingham of March 1984, a number of group shows were staged, which, in their turn, reflected the evolving practice of each artist within the group's shifting lineup. These projects included the Midland Group Nottingham in January 1983, and the following month the Herbert Art Gallery in Coventry. In this instance, a wave of press controversy whipped up around my canvas-based piece of 1982, Another Nigger Died Today, led to an adults-only ruling for part of the show, as well as an assortment of press responses to the exhibition as a whole, ranging from the reactionary to the reflective, informed, and well considered. May-June of that year saw the second show staged at the Africa Centre, which, along with featuring a much reduced lineup, was also the final time that this group showed work together under the title The Pan-African Connection. In part, following the frustrations of the Nottingham Convention of 1984, members of the group dispersed to become part of a wider movement of black artists emerging through a number of collective shows and solo projects through the mid-1980s. These projects began, at their most interesting, to see an evolving away from the collectivizing language of political absolutes into more complex, inflective, gendered, embodied and intimate modes of address in response to, and perhaps in some instances in retreat from, the increasingly unstable and contorted political landscape of the mid-1980s.